Hello and welcome everyone. It's my great honor to welcome you today on behalf of the T20 team. Thank you for joining us from different parts of the world, and a very big welcome to all speakers and panelists. My name is Kamil Al-Ahmed. I work as a research assistant at King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, and I also work as coordinator for Task Force 6, focusing on economy, employment, and education in the digital age. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today, titled COVID-19 Disruption, Digital Transformation and Digital Divide, Educational and Vocational Challenges and Opportunities. Before I move on to introduce you to the program of this session, please allow me to mention that as an effort from the T20 Saudi Arabia to be inclusive, I am happy to announce that this webinar features live captioning. As we are an inclusive T20, the closed captioning feature provides an accessible experience. This service is provided to us by the great team of iMedia, and I would like to thank them in advance. It's a great pleasure that they are joining us. Before I move on to introduce you to the program, in this webinar today, we will be together for about 2 hours. We will first begin with opening remarks followed by a keynote speech, and then we will move on to a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Heidi Al-Askari, the lead co-chair of Task Force 6. The panel will be followed by a Q&A session and then a closing remark. I would love to remind everyone to please write your questions in the chat box at any time, and it will be answered later on. And I would love to remind speakers to please unmute your microphones when you are not using it. I will send a private message to each speaker when their time is about to end. So our session today will kick off by an opening remark given by the chair of T20, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki. Besides his great work as chair of T20, Dr. Fahad works as vice president of research at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Following that, we will have another opening remark given by His Excellency Dr. Munir Dessouky. Dr. Munir is the Assistant Minister at Ministry of Communications and Information Technology of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Munir is also the chair of the Digital Economy Task Force of G20 Saudi Arabia. And without further ado, I give a very strong welcome to both. Dr. Fahad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camille, for the nice introduction, and also for adding the caption. It's a great pleasure to be connected with everybody on this task force, the authors, the co-chairs, and the lead co-chairs, and we appreciate putting this task force meeting together. Despite the short notice and the difficulty that we all facing under the current pandemic. A special thanks to Dr. Munir Dessouky, the chair of the Digital Economy Task Force. We appreciate you accepting the invitation to participate and to take us through how the digital economy priorities are changing in light of the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, let me first note that we are living in a very difficult time, and the COVID-19 pandemic is above all is a human tragedy, and perhaps the most civilizational threat that we have faced in our lifetime. By now, the virus has spread to more than 4 million people in over 180 countries, with a rate of infection that we have never seen in more than a century. And the consequences of it are very clear. There is a huge impact on the way we live, on our healthcare systems, our society, the market, and the economy. And even very strong and well-funded healthcare systems are struggling to keep up with such pandemic, even when introducing strict social distancing measures and other restrictions on the economy. And the socio-economic impact of the crisis are very clear to all of us. I mean, we're looking at global economic growth is turning into the negative territory. And we've seen the IMF forecasting -3 for this year, the largest contraction since the Great Depression, and expecting a +5 next year, which I think they are overly optimistic on it, especially if you factor in the significant rise in unemployment reaching high double-digit numbers in many countries. And SMEs are going out of business, and we're hearing and seeing many large corporations having difficulties managing their cash flow. And on the social side, inequalities are deepening, and we are unable to meet the need of the most vulnerable households, including the elderly and the vulnerable citizens in many places. So if we look at the country level, policymakers are faced with two hard choices, and they are contradicting choices. On one hand, if they don't act immediately and lock down their economy, they will risk thousands of deaths from COVID-19 and probably or surely overwhelm their healthcare system. On the other hand, if they shut down the economy and lock down, they will risk an economic collapse and economic meltdown, with probably a very high level of mortality from non-COVID-19 related reasons, especially in poorer countries. Whatever the choice that they will make, there will be a short-term and a long-term impact on our lives and our economies. And within the context of this task force on the subject of the digital economy, I would like to note that the digital economy has been playing an increasing role even before the crisis as a new driver for the global economy in terms of growth and in terms of social transformation. And the pandemic reinforces this role of the digital technology to the sustainability of the global economy, including the role of the e-commerce, e-schooling, e-invoicing, and e-payments, and also other services, including remote working and also innovative new business ideas. As we go through this crisis, I think it's important to remember and learn from previous crises, where global unity and solidarity should be on top of the priorities, especially as we move and navigate our ways through the crisis. As we highlighted in 3 T20 statements since early March, we need urgent investments in critical public services and global public goods to first suppress the virus and to minimize its economic and social impact, as well as recover better with the minimum losses socially and economically. As an example of these critical public services and global public goods is the role of the digital technology and the relevant digital policies to strengthen, accelerate our collective response to COVID-19. This mirrors the priority of this task force when we set them up back in December and in January, which include training and education in and for the digital economy, the impact of artificial intelligence and technology disruption on employment and workplace, entrepreneurship in the digital age, addressing the digital gender gap, reforming education and the role of early learning, cybersecurity, threats and data privacy, and also global governance framework for data flows and artificial intelligence. From our part, and as we progressed in the T20 process, we have issued the 3 main statements before and after the G20 Extraordinary Summit at the end of March. In all of these statements, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources to businesses, workers, and households, especially in less developing countries. Some of the recommendations that are related to the work of this task force, and in particular the digital economy, include ensuring inclusive, secure and affordable connectivity, especially in remote areas, and also for vulnerable people, as well as supporting businesses to overcome the digital divide. It is an event like this which will bring us together as a think tank community for specifically the subject of this task force, and shows the importance of our contribution to the leaders of the G20 in meeting the global challenges such as COVID-19. Within the context of this task force, there is a growing need to review the privacy, data, and data protection debate from a new angle, as well as the so-called digital FDI, or foreign direct investments in the digital economy, which can especially help in bringing in technology, know-how, and jobs and growth to developing countries. So I encourage you all to participate within this webinar, to actively participate within this webinar, and contribute to the T20 process by maintaining our original mandate, which is providing unbiased, research-based policy recommendations to the leaders of the world. And given the pandemic and the magnitude of this crisis, I would also go beyond giving policy recommendations. Maybe incorporating some initiatives or ideas that we can be shared with the leaders of the G20 in addressing the many challenges of the platform economy. To conclude, I would like to say that once again that the T20 and its partners are devoting their time and effort to help the world in facing the pandemic. And that event like this bring us together and encourage us to share our expertise. And I thank the organizers, especially the leaders of the task force, for doing that. And I look forward to working with all of you and across our with our partners across GCC, G20 countries and non-G20 countries to expedite the transition to recovery while maintaining global digital platform that is safe and secure for all. Thank you for your time, and back to you, Camille.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fahad Turki, for a great opening remark. Now we'll move to His Excellency Dr. Munir Al-Dessouqi.
Thank you, Camille, and thank you, Dr. Fahad, for the kind invitation. Okay, so I see that you put a picture of me that was pre-corona. Thank you for that. This picture, I believe, was taken less than 3 months ago, and I feel like a completely different person in such a short period of time. But that's what we're going through here today. So ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you today in the important webinar focusing on the economy, employment, and education in the digital age by the T20 in response to the current COVID-19 crisis. The human and economic costs of this pandemic are beyond what most of us could have imagined only a short time ago. Meeting this historic challenge is clearly something we can only do together through intelligent and collective actions. I applaud the T20 for the proactive initiative to establish a special task force in response to COVID-19 that was launched on May 5th, as well as holding a series of webinars for each of the T20 11 task forces, where thought leadership discussed the challenge and impact of COVID-19. In addition to the tragic human suffering related to the direct health impacts of the pandemic, the socio-economic consequences are also proving devastating. With regard to the global digital economy, or the global economy in general, as mentioned by Dr. Fahad, the IMF is projecting a reduction of 3% in global GDP, resulting in effects that will be felt long after the end of the pandemic. And in terms of employment, the International Labour Organization expects more than 195 people globally will lose their jobs. And in education, 1.5 billion children do not have the access to e-learning or remote education offerings, which not only disadvantages them today, but will have a lasting effect both on their individual development and the economic future of their countries. At the same time, this grave situation is focusing on data and connectivity and digital technologies, which are the solutions that more extensively and deeply every year help accelerate the digital economy. And we've seen this acceleration moving much faster with COVID-19. For example, with nearly 3 billion people in the world under some form of lockdown, internet traffic has increased by more than 60%. As more people have started to use online education and health services in addition to e-commerce. Over 1 million medical consultations have already taken place in Saudi Arabia alone through an app called Sahati, launched by the Ministry of Health. In education, over 112 subjects are being provided online for students today. In China, for example, online education is currently providing 120 million students with the capacity to have 50 million students connected concurrently, which is extremely impressive. During peak hours, the traffic caused by video conferencing solutions is 24 times higher than before. In the Kingdom alone, the usage of some platforms increased by 600% in April compared to March of the same year. So as I took that picture, some companies grew their market share by 600%. An increase in licenses with the government sector grew by 40%, or roughly today, 40% of our Saudi government employees have licenses to connect remotely. With regards to the digital economy, e-commerce revenues have increased by at least 40% in April and have actually doubled in some geographies. In Saudi Arabia, 95% of the population changed the way they do their shopping and their online behavior. And we expect that at least 70% of them will continue to use online shopping tools and e-commerce way after the pandemic is over. In the context of following the G20 Leaders Extraordinary Summit, the G20 Saudi presidency hosted a virtual G20 Digital Economy Extraordinary Ministerial Meeting to discuss actions to combat the pandemic leveraging digital technologies. In this statement, digital economy ministers agreed to a coordinated set of policies as a response to the growing human and economic impact of the pandemic. I will briefly, in the next few points, mention to you or highlight to you a few of the points that were discussed. First, the ministers emphasized the communications infrastructure and network connectivity, given that maximizing inclusive and affordable connectivity is a prerequisite for an inclusive digital age. And as most of you know, more than 50% of the world today is not connected. Second, the statement highlights the use of digital technologies and solutions to facilitate remote working and learning to support the continuity of social and economic development and activities. And third, it highlights the importance of fostering business resilience by supporting and accelerating the transition to digital businesses and business models, production systems, e-commerce, and smart working solutions. To this end, the digital economy ministers also agreed on the development of a collection of policy options to support digitalization of business models during COVID-19. This initiative will share policies and practices by G20 member states and accelerate the availability and use of digital tools to strengthen business continuity. It will emphasize continuity, remote working, e-learning, and e-commerce, and basically build on enhancing connectivity. At the same time, within our core agenda, we are working to promote the digital economy by facilitating cross-border data flows and advancing an inclusive and human-centric approach to digital technologies and smart cities to ensure sustainable economic development while bridging digital divides. Here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, we are proactively taking actions to ensure the continuity of economic, employment, and educational activities. To list a few examples, the Communications and Information Technology Commission, for example, has issued guidelines for best practices to facilitate remote working for business continuity. And simultaneously, the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology is helping businesses digitize with remote working solutions. And let me give you a few other examples and initiatives that we've launched in the recent months to support dealing with the pandemic. So we launched an initiative to encourage the use of technology for the public and for public awareness, and to support local internet network providers for health and educational platforms. we basically provided all access to government platforms for free in the kingdom for all citizens and residents, as well as initiatives to support digital giving, where we provided students and those with low income computer devices and online education in partnership with the private sector. We donated through private sector participation over 30,000 tablets and computers, and more than 110,000 data SIM cards. We also increased the frequency spectrum by more than 30% to accommodate for the increased network usage. We monitor the network on a daily basis, and we've seen very little impact of the crisis, although the growth in consumption was huge. We launched a global Hope Hackathon to find digital solutions in light of the current crisis. And I believe in this hackathon, over 72 countries participated with great ideas. Additionally, the Kingdom has set up several online training programs with free access to virtual education, e-learning, and e-health portals and applications. One of our programs, for example, gained more than 8,000 beneficiaries in the past 2 months. In the context of work that we're doing, I'm very much looking forward to today's discussions and the T20's views on the policy experimentation, as well as your policy recommendations that will be of great interest to the Digital Economy Task Force. I would like to now pass the floor back to Camille and Dr. Fahad, and we look forward to hearing your views on the economy, employment, education, and the digital age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Munir. Now we'll move on to a keynote speech by Dr. Sandra Willis. And I would like to introduce Dr. Sandra before we go on. Dr. Sandra is an affiliate scholar at the Global Mental Health Lab at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. And she is also the Director of Learning and Knowledge Development at World Enabled in Berkeley, California. Dr. Willis is a psychologist by profession with 20 years of experience in academic, government, and non-government organizations engaging in teaching, mentoring, research, social policy, and social development activities, leading to leadership roles that emphasize turnaround social development strategies. Dr. Willis received her doctorate in psychology with a specialization in intellectual and development disabilities, and has worked in academia as an assistant professor at the California State University in Fullerton, Michigan State University. She is the founder and head of the psychology program in Zayed University, based in Dubai. For the past 12 years, Dr. Willis was responsible for providing strategic advice on integrated social, health, and economic development in Dubai via policy, legislative, and programmatic recommendations, including a Dubai-wide master plan for service delivery, human resources, partnership development, and capital investment. The adopted approach included applied research tools, rigorous analysis, monitoring, and evaluation to ensure that all strategies and policies are contextually appropriate, fiscally responsible, and are evidence-based. She developed macro-level social development strategies to drive policy development and impact assessment that include the Dubai disability, mental health, early childhood development, and parenting strategies. Dr. Willis is continuously inspired to forge on as a disability, mental health, and child rights activist by her family, and always strive for inclusion and equity, tolerance, and diversity. Dr. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
I've never heard my bio read out loud, and I do apologize. I have to reduce it in size. So thank you for bearing through that. And Camille, thank you for reading it so thoroughly. Greetings from Edinburgh, Scotland, even though Dubai is home for the most part. And I'd like to thank the leadership of G20 and T20, and particularly Dr. Heidi Al-Askari for not only her leadership, but her leadership from the human perspective. There's always bringing out humanity. And this is where we've connected for a long time. And for that reason, I'd like to see even more connectivity between the digital and the human. So thank you for the invitation, and I hope to do your time some justice and collectively work together in answering the following question. How does digital transformation affect people's lives and well-being in a post or currently pandemic world? Digital economies expand the boundaries, certainly, of information available to people and enhance innovation and human productivity. There's no doubt about that. However, there is an equivalent increasing risk for people's well-being. Government needs digital tools and citizens' personal data to combat the pandemic crisis that we're currently in. But too much sharing can be at risk to individuals. So how can we strike the right balance between the two? So what does our life look like in these times of pandemic? The coronavirus is a global health emergency with an unknown trajectory. We actually are in the midst of it. We don't know where's the beginning and where's to end. With these unprecedented human, economic, and social costs impacting the health and well-being, political and cultural aspect of our societies, it is testing and imposing almost a moral compass on humanity. So how are we responding? The pandemic has exposed vast inequalities. That's one aspect of the compass, highlighting increased vulnerabilities. It has forced reevaluations, reconsiderations, and reprioritizations on multiple levels, individual, familial, and collective, including institutional, and those that govern them. So if you look at the images, they represent those that I believe are the most vulnerable. The one on the left is in Greece, in a refugee camp. You have a person with disability, an elderly person with disability, with children and other carers in such a situation. Obviously, their risk factors are very high. You have the elderly and, of course, what we call the frontline workers. Next slide, please. So what does that time look like? What does our life look like in times of a pandemic? The coronavirus pandemic has forced us to establish a new way of living while negotiating a rather myopic and unpredictable glimpse of the future. Each day, and in so many ways, we are demonstrating new ways of working, interacting, transacting, and living. Meeting here today is vastly different than meeting in Riyadh, which I had the privilege of doing a few months back. Vastly different, but yet still effective and productive. Our adaptability for the most part has to be recognized as admirable. The pandemic has raised questions about how our societies are ordered and about where we want and need to invest in the future. It has shown us strengths and highlighted our vulnerabilities, such as the inherent inequalities, as I mentioned. It has set new challenges for us, not at the very least which to try to find a vaccine and cure, but to merely exist and function on a daily basis, working, teaching, connecting. So at any given moment, one of my 3 children may actually do a combat army crawl across this floor and hang on to my ankle as I live stream to you, urging me because they need me as a mother, a working mother at home. I wonder how many others are in my position as well. So forgive me if I'm a little distracted. Life in times of pandemic have affected our mental health. The psychological distress in population is widespread, and we actually frankly don't understand it very well, nor have we measured it effectively. So it has immediate health impact of the virus and consequences of our physical isolation, and some have conducted national surveys and have noted high prevalence of distress among their population. Some data is on the right. Many are afraid of infection, dying, losing family members, not being able to grieve those that are lost. Individuals have been physically distracted from loved ones and peers. Millions of people are facing economic turmoil, having lost or are being at risk of losing their income and their livelihoods. How can we minimize such consequences? To minimize the mental health consequences of the pandemic, it is important to consider urgently the following 3 very high-level recommendations we will take forward and we will articulate even further: to apply a whole of society approach to promote, protect, and care for our mental health, ensure widespread availability of emergency mental health and psychosocial support, and support recovery from COVID-19 by building mental health services for the future. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in digital technologies in times of pandemic? Well, we know that digital technology is a key component for our collective effort to tackle the virus and support our new ways of living and working, a reality during this exceptional time. We need to coordinate, complement, and initiate measures to deal with every aspect of the pandemic, whether it's digital, media, telecoms, as well as others. Digital technologies have never been more important in our lives, as evidenced this very moment, and making sure governments have the infrastructure and the connectivity and the regulations, which are for the most part absent, in place to respond to the coronavirus, to keep people active and safe online. It has to be a collective mission, as my children spend most of their day, every day online through virtual learning. Are they safe there? I question that. So what are the domains of digitalization? We have data, artificial intelligence, and supercomputers. They're a major asset in detecting patterns in the spread of the virus, developing potential treatments, and devising strategies for reconstruction in the future in the post-pandemic world. We have telecommunications, networks, and connectivity, which are more vital than ever, with so much of our society actually confined into our homes, self-isolating, and economically dependent. Online platforms and disinformation are important sources of information and activity, but above all, in times of crisis, they are vital information channel. However, are they accessible to all, such as persons with disabilities? Skills, collaborative working, and creativity have digital networks that provide platforms offering a wealth of information and learning, from skill sharing and collaborative working to accessing culture and creativity online. Cybersecurity, trust, and safety online. People need to trust that our networks are secure from attacks, and we need to be sure, as we are individuals, are safe when online. I don't know if any of you have been on a Zoom call that has been hacked. It is not a pleasant experience. So what are the implications for T20 research, policy, and measurement? The digital transformation is affecting every aspect of the human experience to some degree, including privacy, autonomy, agency, and the relationship between citizenship and government. Digitalization and its associated technologies are affecting established patterns of human activity and the human networks and systems within which activities take place, where it be education, employment, security, health, and social institutional domains. Guided by the work of OECD, the European Commission, and the United Nations, among others, there are certain frameworks that we can reference on the dimension of well-being in digitalization and can help structure the T20 research and policy considerations. The policy agendas, mechanisms, and tools, as well as measures for assessing, monitoring, and sustaining human well-being, must therefore adapt to take into account the impact of digitalization and associated technologies, especially now when in the midst of the pandemic. This analysis will suggest a number of priorities for T20's consideration, for all those that have submitted policy briefs and recommendations, for all those conducting active research and monitoring that could support well-being and thus elevate humanity to the center of the digital innovation for an equitable, inclusive, and resilient future. That's the title of this talk. Next slide, please. So the ecosystem of interdependent digital technologies, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, you'd certainly know more about this than I do because I'm a psychologist, is the ecosystem of interdependent digital technologies that underpin this digital transformation process that will drive the future economic and, if I dare say, societal change. The pace of introduction and adoption of these technologies and digitalization processes is rapid and unprecedented. I don't think anybody has a finger on that pulse, the effects of which are felt at all levels, individual, community, society, and nation states. We need to move beyond the optimism and pessimism dichotomy of this process and really look at pragmatism. Placing human impact at the center of the government, industry, and civil society need to understand the impact of this transformation. And there's a dearth of research. There's like what we call a research desert out there on this issue. Much policy attention to date has been on the future of work in response to automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, but aspects of this transformation that affect the individual non-economic social dimensions, systematic consideration and analysis. Next slide, please. So what's the core premise? We need to bring humanity to the forefront and develop systematic way of considering digital transformation through the lens of well-being. We need to consider a range of dimensions from which the policy and political communities will need to engage the broader research and development community, particularly in the areas of human development. So if you look at the framework on the right here by OECD, and if you've drafted and submitted a policy brief or one is under consideration, please take a look and see where does it relate to this particular framework of reference. Next slide, please. And how can you integrate the humanity aspect or the well-being aspect? Because I'm going to present to you the constituent areas of well-being to consider. Human development is the first, including early childhood learning and education. Digital technologies likely affect aspects of human activity and behavior that have been shown to be fundamental for human development, such as parenting and childhood development, building social connections, attachments, empathy, resilience in growth and development. So here's a radical idea. How can we leverage digital technologies and transformation to invest in an optimal early childhood development and parenting practices, develop and implement ethical standards, guidelines, monitoring techniques, as well as indicators for technology use in children and adolescents? I believe we have a wonderful speaker to address these issues today. What about education? Prioritizing, oh, back please, not there yet. Prioritizing individualization and holistic nature of learning. Here's a radical idea. Leveraging digital technologies and transformation to reform educational systems on principles and methodologies of inclusive education. Why? Because that way you don't leave anyone behind. Adult vocational education for learning for all. And finally, under human development, please consider brain development. Investigate digitally triggered physiological, neurological responses and neural patterns that are set with digital interactions and habituations. Translate science to policy and practice, please. And here's another radical idea for your consideration under brain development. Somebody has to investigate the short, medium, long-term effects of digital interaction on brain neurological development, both opportunities as well as drawbacks. Next slide, please. We also, under the well-being framework, need to deep dive into the mental health across the lifespan. This is for your reference about prevalence of mental health and the risk of low capacity and a digital economy that can lose up to 1 trillion per year in productivity due to 2 mental health conditions combined, depression and anxiety. I'll repeat that number again, and I know I'm short of time. $1 trillion per year. It may be due in part to significant demographic changes, but many of these losses, if you will, and concerns for mental health epidemic is the impacts of digitalization on individuals, economy, and society. Next, please. So some policy areas and research for consideration under mental health and well-being. This is just for your reference once again, in case it's pertinent to your area as a guidance. Next slide, please. What about social inclusion as a second dimension? Group formation and dynamics, social capital and trust. We have digital drivers on mental health, sure, but what about on a collective, on a societal level? Persons with disabilities and older persons are among the hardest hit and most marginalized by COVID-19 pandemic. And this is our work with Dr. Victor Pineda, one of the speakers coming up, esteemed speakers coming up. This is not because of their inherent vulnerabilities. No, they're marginalized. And because of their marginalization and the constant barriers that they face, that they are rendered into the state of vulnerability. Till today, they face a lack of accessible public health information and intervention, significant barriers to implementing basic hygiene measures, limited accessible health and social care facilities, whether in services or at home, many of which are deprived of or facilitated by inaccessible digital domains till today, even though we have the standard and guidelines for them. So to what extent are your interventions actually accessible for persons with disabilities and older persons? To compound the difficulties posed by this global pandemic, there's a clear lack of comparable data regarding the effect of the pandemic on persons with disabilities and older persons. Data deserts can render these citizens essentially invisible in current COVID-19 measurements. For some time, they were not even included in reporting the death rates on a country level. All spheres of government steered by T20 and led by G20 will need to make additional efforts now to ensure persons with disabilities and older persons have access to public services as livelihoods, safety, and in fact their lives determine the quality of societies and their leadership. At the risk of sounding even more dramatic than I do already, we literally are leaving them behind to die. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to end as a segue for the personal public security, whether individuals or group. One emergent issue of personal public security relates to the increasing potential for real and immediate impacts on various forms of virtual, online, and remote surveillance technologies. Cyberbullying and misuse of social media can polarize, fragment societies, threatening our sense of well-being. And I believe we have an esteemed speaker to address this issue as well. Next slide. Thank you for your time, and I welcome all questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandra, for a remarkable keynote speech. I'll move the mic now to Dr. Heidi Al-Askari. Dr. Heidi is the lead co-chair of Task Force 6. She also works as a research fellow at King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies and as a CEO of the Special Olympics. We're all looking forward to a great discussion on this panel. Dr. Heidi, you have the mic.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, Dr. Fahad, Dr. Munir. It's a pleasure being here with you. Dr. Sandra, thank you very much for bringing in that very human element to the digital age and a lot of the discussions we've had over the past few months. I really appreciate that addition. When I first was asked to lead and support this task force, I remember sitting down looking at all the topics thinking, wow, this is quite a diverse task force in terms of the topical areas. It's basically everything in there. And I felt a great sense of responsibility. With great opportunity comes great responsibility. And we have this opportunity right now. It was always very serious to us, but particularly after COVID-19. I think this task force took on a whole different feel and a whole different sense of urgency. So for everybody in the network who's joined us today, for our authors, people who submitted abstracts and policy briefs, and for my co-chairs, my fellow co-chairs who have been our rock throughout this interesting period, I thank you. And I wanna say what we do here is important and it has impact. We may look back in history and say some of the work that started here was proposed here and continued far after the G20 is what shaped the future that we're going towards. So thank you. I don't take this lightly. I appreciate all of your comments. And I'm very cognizant, as Dr. Sandra said, that everything that we're talking to today are the results of what we need to survive as humans. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, is that sometimes it doesn't matter how much we have, how little we have, it's about being human and being able to address the most fundamental basics of being human. Education, employment, in Maslow's pyramid, those are the basics. We have to ensure them, they are rights. So looking at the issues that we're gonna discuss today, we've tried to really select a grouping of our policy briefs that really tell a story that crosses and encompasses all of the topical areas that we're looking at. So I don't want to speak a lot. I really want to give our speakers a chance to really take the stage and throw out ideas and concepts for our audience to really think about and to come back to us with really scintillating questions that really get us to think so that we can come together collectively. So my goal is going to be to introduce and create the platform. We do have prepared questions for our panelists in case we need them, but I'm actually, once the panelists are done, going to open up questions to our network. I believe that you're here to listen, but we're all also here to listen to you. So we really want to hear your feedback. What I would like to suggest is throw your questions in the Q&A just in case you forget them as we go along. And we will definitely tackle them as soon as we're done. Our first topic today is, as a mom, it's near and dear to my heart. As has been stated by Dr. Munir, Dr. Sandra, even Dr. Fahad, we are living in an unprecedented age where we saw children shift immediately into this digital world and online world. They were getting there, but the shift that happened with COVID-19 is unprecedented. With that opportunity comes a lot of risks. Again, as a mom, as an educator, as somebody who works in the domain of disability, what are the risks of being left out? What are the risks of not being left out and being overly seen? What are the risks of being hurt by using this technology? Layered on top of that are what are the risks of collecting data in ways that can be used in ways we don't want them to be used against our children in the future? What do we have in terms of protective mechanisms and what are the issues surrounding this? To really address this issue, Dr. Mohammed Khan, I'm very honored to be introducing him. He will be joining us and presenting on the issue of fostering a safer cyber space for children. Dr. Mohammed Khan is currently working as a professor of cybersecurity at the Center of Excellence of Information Assurance at King Saud University here in Saudi Arabia. He's a founder and CEO of the Global Foundation of Cyber Studies and Research. He's the editor-in-chief of Telecommunication Systems Journal published by Springer Nature. He's also on the editorial board of several journals published by IEEE, Springer, and Wiley. He's published over 375 publications and invented 10 patents. He's also secured several national and international awards and grants in the area of cybersecurity. Dr. Khan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dr. Heidi. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good day to you all. Before I start my presentation, I would like to pay my gratitude to Dr. Heidi for inviting me to speak today in this wonderful webinar with well-reputed speakers and panelists. So today I'm going to talk about an interesting and important topic entitled Fostering a Safer Cyberspace for Children. This work is at the intersection of a policy brief which was contributed to the T20 in collaboration with Professor Umaima Bamasakh and Dr. Muhammad Al-Qarni from University of Jeddah and Dr. Abdullah Al-Qarni from the Institute of Public Administration, Saudi Arabia. So as you know that we live in a world which is more connected than ever before. Currently more than 4.5 billion people around the world use the internet, which is almost 60% of the world's total population. The number of internet users around the world is growing exponentially. And only in the last 12 months, it has grown over 300 million people, which means 800,000 new internet users each day. As per our research, on a global average, internet users spends almost like 6.5 hours online each day. Added together, the world's internet users will spend more than 1.25 billion years of human time online in 2020 alone, which is too much actually. The world has dramatically change, over the past few months, especially in 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic impacting almost every aspect of our lives. These changes have clearly evident in the world's digital behaviors, especially as billions of people turn to connected devices to help them cope with life and work under the lockdown and quarantine situations. More and more people are using smartphones, laptops, desktop computers, tablets, streaming devices, gaming consoles, and Internet of Things devices to spend everyday time for work, education, entertainment, and communication. In the era of COVID-19, there is a great surge in the use of social media around the world, and there are currently 3.8 billion social media users, which are growing at the rate of approximately 9% per year. An average global user spends at least 2.5 hours on social media each day, which varies considerably by cultures and regions geographically. I don't know how much time you spend, but it's just an average. Next slide, please. On the other hand, children represent over 25% of the total world's population, and being online is an important part of their lives. There are over 1 billion children using the internet, and each new day, another 170,000 go online for the first time in their lives. So there were statistics before COVID-19 pandemic, but with the introduction of strict social distancing and quarantine measures, there has been a global surge in the number of children and young people using the internet and digital technologies. The social distancing, as we have, all the measures we are having, and I'm staying at home and you are also staying in your homes, have urged all the children to use social media, online games, websites, and applications, which can be easily accessed through mobile devices and any kind of digital devices. There is a company that's called KidLogger, which develops a parental control system. They conducted a survey and tried to find out what children are doing online every day. So as per their study, 30% of children like to watch movies, cartoons, and TV series on the internet. 26% have interest in social media websites like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. 17% are browsing internet for school information such as homework and assignments, and 14% are playing online games. And they do have some other activities also on the internet, for example, reading books, music, and so on. Next slide, please. So the digital world has never perceived as an environment where childhood would take place, and it was not designed by keeping children in mind. Though the internet provides abundance of opportunities for children's learning and growth, but it also exposes them to new type of risks. Let's say that we are using Zoom, and our kids are using WebEx and Microsoft Teams for online education, but these tools are not developed for them, so they are not developed to keep them in mind. So according to a study, that was conducted by National Cybersecurity Alliance, children from 8 to 18 years old spend 7 hours and 38 minutes per day online, which is too much. These alarming statistics indicate that controlling and managing children's online experience is of paramount concern to protect them from cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities. A recently published report from DQ Institute, which includes data from more than 145,000 children, found that 60% of 8 to 12 years old children across the 30 countries are exposed to cyber risk, which they call cyber pandemic. So we are having COVID-19 pandemic, but they are also having a very good coining a term that is called cyber pandemic. So the cybersecurity risk could be categorized as content, contact, and conduct risk. If you see the content risk, they could be including that children might be, find uncomfortable contents or disgusting online contents coming to them accidentally while they are using the internet. This might include the violence, pornography, spam, phishing emails, malwares, and viruses, and so on. On the other hand, if you see the contact risk, which may include children getting into the contact with strangers or adults masquerading as children. For example, a child could be bullied by others or by some hackers to get some personal information from children for misuse. Furthermore, they could be predators also, and there could be some malicious forums to promote radicalization and extremist ideologies, which could persuade them to take part in unhealthy and dangerous actions, which is very, very dangerous for our society. Lastly, the conduct risk, if you see on the down here, they include children behaving in different ways that might hurt others by bullying, harassment, promoting hateful materials or blogs, and inciting racism. So the COVID-19 pandemic, has led to an unprecedented rise in screen time and online activities, which leave children vulnerable to online abuses, violence, extremism, hacking, privacy violation, and bullying. So therefore, it is indispensable for governments, policymakers, digital platforms developers, parents, educators, civil society organizations, and law enforcement agencies to join forces and to keep children safe and secure through creating awareness, introducing safety and security features into their products, and developing new tools and mitigate security risks. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So to build a safe and resilient cyberspace for children, what we need to do is that we need to address all the challenges with a collaborative and coordinated response at national, regional, and global levels. And we know that UNICEF, International Telecommunication Unit, and many civil society organizations around the world are working in this area, though their efforts are commendable, but not enough to address this all unprecedented online challenges. So there is a dire need to build global capacity building program under G20. And I think it is imperative to establish a focal point in the G20 context by establishing a center of excellence in child online protection, which could work as a central point of contact and source of coordination for building capacity and capability in the world. So this center could work in collaboration with multi-stakeholders, including international bodies, policymakers, religious figures, and civil society to promote strategies that could address, children online safety awareness and legislative measures at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels. And it is worth mentioning that Saudi Arabia has recently launched a global initiative for child online protection, and it will be very much encouraging if G20 sponsored Center of Excellence could be established in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to complement their global efforts, which would be very, very nice. And secondly, on some terrorist organizations, even more terrorist organizations, they have penetrated into the cyberspace and used it in different malicious ways, for example, from online recruitment and fundraising to the broadcasting of violent contents, and unfortunately, children are becoming their soft and key target because children are very innocent. They don't know anything, so they can easily phish them. So hence, there is a need to develop a framework to protect children from radicalization and extremism, which are becoming a global security threat and making a huge impact on the well-being and stability of our society. As you know that not all countries in the world are English-speaking countries, and most of the protecting guidelines are not present in their native languages, so which is a stumbling block in cybersecurity awareness. So there is a dire need to collaborate, to work together, and to develop a multilingual child online protection guide that may benefit from global experiences and expertise from different.
Sorry, Dr. Khan, if you could just wrap up.
Yeah, just 1 minute. So this initiative could guarantee that an underdeveloped community would have the same knowledge of guidelines as all the people in the world have. So G20 community could also work together to propose a framework to develop cyber standards, procedures to help children safe from online threats. And this could be establishment of policies to encourage appropriate online behavior, the use of filtering and firewalls to prevent access to inappropriate contents, and education about the cyber risk. Law enforcement could also play an imperative role to ensure cyber safety and protection. For example, online threats, we have cyberbullying, cyber stalking, online harassment, and so on. And despite a lot of contributions we have from different stakeholders, which play a vital role for complementing our efforts in this area, the major global challenges remain unaddressed across several dimensions. So unless policies specifically address children protection and safety online, there is high risk of increasing incidents issues in the years to come, especially in the post-COVID-19 world. So G20 is the best position to combine these efforts into a cohesive and integrated strategy to foster a safer cyberspace for children. Hence, children's cybersecurity is a global issue. Therefore, we need a global response and cooperation from all the stakeholders. This is a very important topic, and time as I have a limitation of time, so I just try to highlight the key and paramount challenges with some strategic recommendations to make our children safe and secure in the cyberspace. So we always have that cybersecurity is our shared responsibility. With this, I conclude my speech, and thank you very much for your listening and attention. Over to you, Dr. Heidi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. And we really appreciate you highlighting all the various components. And I know we could probably have a whole webinar just on that topic, and maybe we will. Greatly appreciate it. To jump right into the next step. So we wanted to highlight the issues around the security around digital use within the current world and situation. But we also wanted to put it in perspective in terms of a continuum that is very difficult to differentiate sometimes where one begins and another ends, which is the education employment continuum. Education starts early on and you continue as you grow. But then there comes a point in time where education really is the beginning of your employment career and your lifelong learning path. So our next three speakers will be tackling that continuum, starting with an overview of education in the digital age and some of the challenges in terms of building resilience in terms of education and thinking about education in a digital world. And then we're going to sort of foray into a very specific example of skills that might be needed that are deemed as some of the critical skills for the future, which is fintech and financial digital literacy. And then from there, we're also going to talk about what does that mean in the world of work? What does that mean practically today for everyone that's living today in this crisis? When we have 50.8 million people who are displaced, 1 to 2 billion people with disabilities or some form of disability, depending on how you define it, that before the crisis, 80% were unemployed and had difficulty finding education that would get them into gainful employment. So having said that, I am very honored to begin by introducing Dr. Angela Lyons. Dr. Angela Lyons is also one of our, actually has 2 policy briefs with us. She's one of the authors, part of the team of the authors that, that submitted these 2 policy briefs. And I would like to have a special thank you. Dr. Angela not only submitted the 2 policy briefs, her and her co-author did it under duress as they were recovering from being ill. So we're so happy to have her with us and so glad that we received her briefs. Dr. Angela is a professor and director for the Center for Economic and Financial Education at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in the US. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Texas and is widely recognized as an international expert in household finance and behavioral economics. Her research focuses on emerging issues related to economic and financial inclusion, financial and digital literacy, poverty and wealth inequalities, and the financial security and protection of vulnerable populations. To date, Dr. Lyons has assisted over 40 countries in designing practical and sustainable models to improve the economic and financial resilience of communities worldwide. Currently, she and her colleagues are working with the UNHCR, WEF, and UNICEF to examine the vulnerabilities and resilience of the economic livelihoods of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Welcome, Dr. Lyons. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Heidi. I want to also very much thank the leadership of the T20 and the TF6 for giving us this opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing, and especially to you, Dr. Heidi, for the amazing and phenomenal leadership that you've provided to us all during this unprecedented time that we were not expecting with this go around with the T20. So thank you. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to take this opportunity to seize on the fact that we are going through COVID-19. And I wanted to just highlight some of the key lessons that I think that we are learning right now about this shift that we've had to do to education. I know just here at our own university, we had 1 week to put all of our classes online and to make that transition. And this was what was going on around the world. And I think being just a part now of this natural experiment, there are several key lessons that we can learn from this. But I wanted to highlight 3 of them. If we could go to the next slide. Yes, so let's go to the next slide. So the first one is, I think right now what we're doing in terms of the big picture is that we're going through this rediscovery of what digital education is and what it's not. I think we've always, as educators, had this debate about is online and digital learning as effective as traditional in-person learning? And I think what we are discovering right now is that, you know, there's some things we can do really well online with digital education, but there are some things that I think we're having to acknowledge the limitations that we can't do so well. And we're having to reevaluate this within the context of current content, learning objectives, curricular design, assessments, target audiences. And this summer is going to be a key moment for us in doing that. And thinking about what this new normal is. Because even after the pandemic, we're not going to put this back in the box. We've made all this effort so fast to digitalize education. Now we really have to think about what is meaningful, what can we do well, what is it that is still challenging that maybe we cannot. And so especially if we think about TVET, you think about the hands-on vocational training that oftentimes it is required that you have personal contact, that you be present to get the hands-on experience and know-how that you need. So we have to think about this within this new normal. The second big lesson that we've learned here, if we can go to the next slide, is that I think we have really learned the value of human connectedness and engagement. And I think as an educator, I really appreciate this, because as a teacher, to know that in-person education does really matter for the students and instructors. And we felt that in the classroom. The students knew, you know, I'm a researcher, but I don't need to do a bunch of studies on this to know that it does matter now. As an instructor, I felt this in terms of the interpersonal connection with my students and that loss. And so the new challenge right now, especially for institutions in education at all levels, we're going to have to assess what the value of that human connectedness is and what that means post-pandemic. And as an economist in particular, educational institutions are going to be forced right now to think about what the economic value of that is and be able to clearly communicate that to the user, especially students and parents. If I give the example here within our own framework in the US, there's a lot of discussion and debate right now. You know, what is the difference between online education now from an institution such as Harvard versus my own institution here at the University of Illinois versus just going to a local, more community college type of institution. And so we really have to better communicate what this new value is to the end user. And so we're going to be designing to operationalize this human connection and engagement within this online learning environment. And with that, we're going to have to really think about the quality of online education and how we're going to evaluate that moving forward. Okay, so let's take a look at, I think, the third big lesson that we've learned so far out of this. And that is how we're reaching vulnerable populations during this unprecedented time. I think also this was interesting to me because in all the digital literacy things that I do, there's always these issues of connectivity and ICTs, and we need to make sure that everybody has the access. And what is so interesting is that right now we're finding out that's the easy part. And what is more challenging are some of these issues that you're hearing here today: privacy, data security, language barriers, legal restrictions, identification and documentation issues in terms of the access. So getting the infrastructure with the technologies in place has not been maybe as difficult as we thought it would be, especially as the private sector in a lot of ways has stepped up on that. But we have to think about the heterogeneities in learning needs right now, and really think about what it means to create meaningful and engaging learning experiences online to meet those diverse needs. And this comes to one of the other big surprises that was emphasized earlier in the initial talk. And that was, I don't think anything prepared us for the mental health and well-being issues that came along with this on the education front. We, if we think about it in terms of just putting on education online in a normal time period without the pandemic, that has a whole host of challenges in and of itself. But add on top of that the pandemic and the stress and anxiety that students are under, parents are under. We think about the environments that some of our students are now in, moving back home. Oftentimes they have new responsibilities. They may be taking care of children and things like that. So we're having to reassess these issues and deal with a lot of these kind of mental health and well-being issues. And this comes also to resetting work-life balance within this framework. And I think that leads nicely to the work that my colleague and I, Josephine Kazana, who's at St. Joseph's University in Beirut. If we go to the next slide, we've been working on a couple policy briefs, and I'm going to just go through these very quickly because I just have a few more moments. But this first one, can we go back just a moment? The title of this is Building Resilience and Enabling Livelihoods of Vulnerable Populations with Digital Inclusion. If we could go ahead, we're going to skip a few slides here. So if we can go ahead, a few more, a couple more. This one. The one with the picture. Yes, thank you. So the general gist of this brief is that we're trying to design a digital livelihood index that helps to capture this transition that we need from digital knowledge and skills to the digital economy and society, to translating that into the digital framework of e-health, e-learning, telework, all of these things, to helping to build better connections to society and the economy, and be able to function more fully within society, that ultimately will help to build resilient communities and to help achieve the sustainable development goals. And so what we're trying to do with this brief is lay out that framework. I know there was mention earlier about some of these dimensions. So this was a nice setup for the work that we're doing, and especially within the context of the Syrian refugees that we're working with in Lebanon, thinking about this kind of model and even getting them connected with digital skills and digital tools to be able to function in a digital economy and society. But we're trying to lay out those pathways, identify the dimensions, and show how, from a research standpoint, we can actually measure this so that we can do cross-country comparisons. We can look at sub-dimensions to help identify within certain populations or make comparisons across countries to see where maybe some of the weak points are in terms of some of those dimensions, and how we can better do more targeted programs, services, policies. And so if we continue, so this is kind of a little bit about the first brief we're working on. And if we can kind of continue here with a few slides to go to the next brief. So we've made some recommendations here, which our brief will come out soon. So if we could just move ahead. Yes, this one. So the second brief then is focusing on digital financial inclusion and rebuilding the livelihoods of forcibly displaced populations. And again, this work is motivated by our work again in Lebanon with the Syrian refugees. And forcibly displaced populations right now are under particular duress during COVID-19. The digital divides, are just magnified for them, and they're already facing the challenges of trying to assimilate into their host communities. The host communities have pressures on them also, and so we're trying to think about how can we use digital inclusion and what is needed in terms of infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, even digital financial literacy, which Dr. Morgan will speak about here next. And so if we go here a few slides, let's see, we can go a little bit. So we're recommending for all of these a coordinated effort and approach for both briefs, that we need to have a global organization and effort. Also, one component of both of these, I am a behavioral economist by training, but I also do design thinking. And I think it's really important as we try to think about creative solutions right now, that we look at solutions from a human-centered design approach, and that we look at it from the user approach, especially for vulnerable populations, so that we are designing products and services within a digital capacity that are really melding with their everyday daily life and the activities that they have to do, especially with digital financial services. And so it makes meaning for them in terms of how they're going to use them and be actively engaged with these technologies.
So if we could wrap up sort of.
Yes, so I was just at that point. So with that, I just want to thank you again, Heidi. Yes, it's wonderful. Yes, perfect timing. So I just thank you, Heidi, for this opportunity. I'm really grateful. So
and we're grateful to have you with us, healthy and well. Thank you, Dr. Lyons. Greatly appreciated. That was quite a lot of information in several briefs. So my hat's off to you, or my tarha's off to you, in the sense that you covered it extremely well, and I look forward to many questions from our attendees today to help you challenge this more, think about it more, think about some of the things that were said and really where we want to go. So having said that, and sort of forayed very high level, but as much as we could in such a short period of time, we're going to move into a very specific example of some of the skills that individuals need in today's digital world, which is the financial digital literacy. And here to present, I'm very honored to present Dr. Peter Morgan. Dr. Peter Morgan, for me personally, has been a moral support and a mental health support for me. He was my predecessor in T20 Japan. He led this task force there very eloquently and with a lot of grace and competency. So he was a hard act to follow, but he's been very generous with his patience, time, and advice. And it's meant a lot to me. Dr. Morgan is part of the Asia Development Bank. He joined them back in 2008. Previously, he served in Hong Kong, China as Chief Asia Economist for HSBC, where he was responsible for macroeconomic analysis and forecasting for Asia. Before that, he was the Chief Japan Economist for HSBC and held comparable positions with Merrill Lynch, Barclays, and Jardine Fleming. Prior to entering the financial industry, he worked as a consultant for Meta Systems Incorporated in Cambridge, Massachusetts, specializing in energy and environmental areas, including energy policy issues in Asian countries, and at International Business Information KK in Tokyo, specializing in financial sector consulting. His research focuses on macroeconomic policy and financial sector regulation, reform, financial development, financial inclusion, fintech, financial literacy, and financial education. So we're very honored to have him here. He's also a co-chair with us. We're very lucky to have him on our task force. Dr. Morgan, the floor is yours.
Hey, Heidi, thanks very much. I'm delighted to have been invited to present at this webinar, and I'd like to thank Dr. Heidi and her team for their great support and enthusiasm and hard work. I should mention that I got an email from Dr. Heidi at 4 a.m. Saudi time this morning, so I know the team was working very hard. But if you could skip to the title page, please. So I'm going to be talking about finance. In particular, the theme here is minding the gaps in digital financial education strategies and implications of COVID-19. So this is based on the policy brief that I'm working on together with my colleagues at ADBI, Dr. Bihong Huang and Dr. Long Trin. So first, I'd like to give a little bit of background to motivate this particular subject. So I'll talk about a bit about financial inclusion, which is the ultimate objective that we're aiming at with this work on education. Talk about the importance of financial literacy and financial education, and then the promise and challenge of fintech, which gives the stimulus for being so concerned about digital financial literacy. And then the need for digital financial literacy, minding the gaps on fintech awareness and use, and then on top of that, the latest implications and challenges of COVID-19, and then finally some policy recommendations. So just the definition of financial inclusion from the OECD. Financial inclusion refers to the process of promoting affordable, timely, and adequate access to regulated financial products and services, and broadening the access by all segments of society. Sorry. And broadening the use by all segments of society through the implementation of tailored, existing, and innovative approaches, including financial awareness and education, with a view to promote financial well-being as well as economic and social inclusion. So it's a big target overall, aiming toward this economic and social inclusion. And the G20 has been looking at financial inclusion for about a decade now. In 2010, the G20 endorsed the Financial Inclusion Action Plan and established the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. And then this FIAP was updated in 2014, and acknowledged the importance of fintech, including a commitment to implement the G20 principles for innovative financial inclusion. And this chart on the right just shows the relationship between financial inclusion. Here, this is the most commonly used measure, which is the percent of adults with an account at a formal financial institution against per capita GDP. And you can see that there's a very close relationship. But the key point here is that the low-income countries still have relatively low rates of financial inclusion. And you see the same thing in individual countries, that the low-income groups, the disadvantaged groups, have less access to financial services. And going on to financial literacy, here it's defined by the OECD INFE as a combination of awareness, knowledge, skill, attitude, and behavior necessary to make sound financial decisions and ultimately achieve individual financial well-being. So the point here is that it's multidimensional, and it reflects not only knowledge, but also skills, attitudes, and actual behavior. And it's recognized as being very important for individuals and firms to enable them to take full advantage of improved financial access. And the G20 also has been quite active in this area. At the Los Cabos Summit in 2012, they endorsed the high-level principles on national strategies for financial education as proposed by the OECD INFE. And then in 2016, they focused more on digital financial literacy and endorsed the high-level principles for digital financial inclusion, which includes Principle 6 on strengthening digital and financial literacy and awareness. However, they didn't quite put the two words together. It's still digital and financial literacy. And as a matter of fact, there's still no official definition of a digital financial literacy. But you can also see on this chart, which shows the financial literacy score by OECD against per capita GDP. But again, the low-income countries do not fare very well in terms of financial literacy levels. And again, you see the same picture on an individual country basis. And then fintech comes along. So we have financial technology, which is a new breed of firms that specialize in providing financial services, primarily through technologically enabled mobile and online platforms. So different from early generations of finance-related technology, which focused on providing services to financial firms, this instead, they provide services directly to consumers. And the promise is that fintech innovation has lowered the barriers to entry, expanded access to financial services, and challenged traditional understanding about how finance works. And the key example here is the mobile phone. Given the very great diffusion of mobile phones globally, it's the key platform to expand access to financial services. However, there are significant challenges. Fintech requires new knowledge on the part of users to recognize and manage risks. And of course, there's also the risk that it could increase the digital divide. And so we focused on the need for digital financial literacy. As I said, there's no official definition, so we made our own in our policy brief last year during the Japan T20, and this was also done with my co-authors, Bihong Wang and Long Trin. So it includes knowledge informing areas, fintech products and services, their benefits and drawbacks, new kinds of risk associated with fintech products and services like phishing, hacking, cyber theft, identity theft, ways to protect oneself from these risks, and methods of redress if losses or the damage from those risks do arise. And it includes knowledge about the four main areas of payments, such as e-money, mobile phone wallets, asset management, such as internet banking, online brokers, alternative finance, such as crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending, and others such as internet-based insurance services. And we've been doing survey work to identify where the gaps are. And so this is a result of some work that we've done in China and Vietnam. Interestingly, the gaps between men and women in terms of fintech awareness and use are not so great, but we do see very significant gaps, for example, between urban and rural residents and between those people with higher incomes and those people who have less income. So these gaps are quite significant. And then what are the implications then of COVID-19? Clearly, with all the work from home and social distancing, COVID-19 in general will encourage the shift towards the digital economy, including all aspects of fintech. And this will further emphasize the need for digital literacy in general and digital financial literacy in particular. But COVID-19 may also exacerbate gaps in access to both financial services and financial education. So given that disadvantaged groups typically are less educated, in-person training implemented by NGOs and financial institutions in their neighborhood will also probably be needed to increase the effectiveness of education programs. But precisely the question is, how do you implement this in a situation of COVID-19? I think this is really the major challenge that COVID-19 poses in terms of potentially increasing these gaps. So our policy recommendations are to develop and implement tools to measure digital financial literacy, since it's a new concept, to then develop digital financial education strategies and programs. And one of our suggestions is that the G20 should establish guidelines for the inclusion of fintech and big tech companies in national financial education strategies, and promote recommendations that fintech and big tech firms be required to promote, to provide a certain level of digital financial education to the customers, especially the disadvantaged groups. And the G20 member countries should also develop guidelines for coordinated online and offline models to be included in national financial education strategies. But this again bumps up against the challenge posed by COVID-19, and we're still trying to develop ideas to address this particular challenge. So let me stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. I always find it educational listening to you. Like I said, this is not necessarily my area of expertise, but I do value the importance of this topic and why it's important, particularly how it can be detrimental for persons who don't have it or don't have access to it. The concept that something isn't defined clearly, particularly in a COVID-19 era, is definitely an opportunity to redefine and build and really look at what does it mean today. You know, even if we had a very clear definition yesterday, we may find coming out of where we are today that this whole definition gets revamped and looked at in different ways. So I think we're at that precipice. That's a great opportunity to look at it. So thank you for the details but conciseness of your presentation and giving us something to really grab onto and think about. Our next speaker is also a co-chair and an amazing colleague, and has been so inspirational and supportive to Task Force 6. If you ever need somebody to jump in, you can always call Paul up. He's ready to go. And actually, my whole team has been that way, so I can't complain. I've been very blessed. But I'm very grateful and very happy to be presenting Mr. Paul Granger. Paul Granger is the co-director of the Center for Education and Work and enterprise lead for the Department of Education, Practice and Society at the University College London Institute of Education. He undertakes professional development research and dissemination on formally assessed and post-compulsory education. This has involved investigations into effective teaching strategies, curriculum delivery, and models of assessment. He has wide knowledge of the responses of institutions and professionals to policy change and leads on studies into strategic planning, management, and government development within the TV/ET sector. Recent research includes a comparison of curriculum arrangements across jurisdiction with high PISA ratings and review of progressive from TV/ET to higher education. At present, he's looking at successful and inclusive regional skills systems, patterns of entry into work, and the importance of skill strategies for regional regeneration. He studied the significance of sticky places in developing high skill systems and the potential impact on the fourth industrial revolution on entrepreneurial activity. He's examining the likely impact of COVID-19 on economic activity. To add to all of that pragmatic on-the-ground experience, Mr. Granger has also been a member of G20 task forces since 2018 within this particular task force. So we're very fortunate to have his perspective on how things have been moving within this task force, where they were, where they're going, and a very pragmatic view on what policy developers should be thinking about when they're proposing policies that not only work through the G20, but work once they are proposed on the ground. Mr. Granger, the floor is all yours. Hello, Paul, are you with us? So while we try and get Paul back on, let me just check, is Dr. Victor Pineda with us? Okay. The challenges of technology right in front of us. These are the pros and cons. All right, so while we try and get both Paul and Victor back with us, why don't I pass it on to Camille to maybe monitor some questions and pose some questions to our speakers while we try and get our the rest of our panel back on board. So do we have any questions from our attendees to the panelists who've already presented?
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahdi. Actually, we still have not received any question yet.
Okay, so why don't I open the floor to any questions?
Yes, we are open for any question.
We're also open to any questions or any comments that you've seen, particularly since what you've already seen are a number of the policy briefs. If you have a perspective on the policy brief or a comment, a clarification, we're very open to hearing that. This is the best opportunity to continue to define and refine what it is we're trying to propose so that it has the most impact. Okay. We have a question. Please go ahead, Ms. Abir. If you can use the Q&A function. Okay, here you go. All right. All right, so the question is, with regards to persons with disabilities, what are the greatest challenges ahead with regards to youth cyber safety? So perhaps Dr. Khan, if you would like to take that.
Hey, Dr. Hadi, thank you. Thank you very much, Abir Abdullah, for your nice question. Well, the challenges, especially the children and young population harboring on the internet, almost same, the people who are healthy people, because like I just mentioned you here, 3 examples. We have 3-dimensional, cyber risks for the people and the children on the internet. The first risk is digital risk, like we are talking about cyber risk. Second risk is about mental health, risk, which is about their psychological, health. And the third one is about their physical, because because of the quarantine and all the measures which we have, staying home, children cannot go outside, so they are playing on the internet, so they are socializing on the internet, so they are harboring a lot of challenges because of that. And physically, if you see that, they can get obese also. Obesity is a big problem for them because they are staying all the time at home. And on the other hand, they are not socializing and they are not going to play with other children, physically. So they can have a lot of mental health, problems, psychological problem, disorders. So these things are focused for all the children, regardless of the, disabled children or, the people who are healthy. So I think safety and security, implications are same for them. But of course, if some children which are having the disability with respect to their, eyesight and, the other, things, then there could be some different, landscape of challenges for them. Though we are specifically focusing the challenges in our policy brief for all the landscape of the challenges which we have for the children. So I think this is a very good point, and we would also consider this also into our policy brief which we are doing and contributing to the T20. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. I don't know, Sandra, would you like to address that as well from the perspective of inclusion and some of the things we've seen in terms of mental health and other issues?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Can you hear me, everybody?
It's a little low. If you could just raise your voice slightly.
I think this might help. Okay. Yeah, I think in terms of invisible disabilities in particular. So when we talk about invisible disabilities, we talk about persons with psychosocial disabilities or mental health disorders. There's a greater concern for vulnerability, particularly in the digital domain, because they may be, in fact, diagnosed with either anxiety or stress-related disorders or depression, or maybe even developmental disorders. So youth in that category, or in that context, I believe there are both opportunities and risks for their engagement in the digital domain. The opportunities are that if, in fact, the digital sphere is accessible, they may develop a voice, a presence. If, let's say, the physical environment is not accessible, maybe the digital domain will render access to the world if in fact the physical environment is constraining. So in that regard, I see that there are opportunities to also connect with other people like themselves, struggling with life and life challenges, and may have even not only developed their own voice, but maybe develop a sense of community and a sense of belonging with others. We've seen cases again and again of persons on the autism spectrum, for example, gaining an online community and a sense of belonging, where organized systems like systems of education are very restrictive and difficult and full of barriers that are attitudinal in addition to infrastructure and institutional. Now, the negative and the constraints obviously are those with intellectual disabilities, who may be particularly prone and vulnerable, more so than others, because, well, the tendency is to believe and to become available, to engage, and predators can really sort of hone in and target such populations, which is concerning. So, but I do believe all youth are vulnerable, and double vulnerability comes if their disability prevents them from understanding the safety measures and privacy measures of online interaction, digital interaction.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandra. And yes, I completely agree with both your comments. There's multiple forms of disability. It's not one category. And I think we have to be very cognizant that there's a huge range of abilities and vulnerabilities there. We've heard a lot about individuals who have been at risk for suicidal tendencies or attempted suicide. And certainly sometimes being in that sort of cavern on your own and just having the digital outlet can either actually be a support or it can actually take you further down that rabbit hole. And I don't think we've actually really looked at all of those risks and do you become culpable and how's that culpability, etc. So you do have a lot of issues going on, but thank you for asking that question. And I see Dr. Wafa Taiba, who's also one of our other authors on another policy brief that works on the cybersecurity for children from a rights-based perspective. She had a few comments. So one of her comments was they will be at greater risk to fulfill these emotions and at risk much more for potential abuse and bullying. And these are the kinds of things that we need to consider. I just want to check very quickly before I move on to some of the other questions. I see we have Mr. Granger back on board. So if the attendees will allow me the flexibility of being a bit agile with our schedule here, I would like to invite Mr. Granger to go ahead and present his part. Thank you, Paul.
Well, apologies for crashing just at the crucial moment. The computer froze and I was panicking around switching plugs on and off. If we move to the first slide, can you hear me? Yep. The implications for work and employment, and there are two aspects to this, and the next slide shows that there are changes to the content of work, the things that we'll be doing, but also there are major changes to the nature of employment. So in the next slide, what's happening to us at the moment is not something new. The pandemic has, obviously it's brought in social distancing and what have you, but we've always been wary of contagion. But what it's done is it's provided a catalyst to accelerate things that were already happening, which we'd called the fourth industrial revolution. 1 is steam, 2 is electricity, 3 is computers, and 4 is artificial intelligence, and particularly the use of data. It's quite clear that after the economic shutdown, many businesses will not survive. Many existing firms will not survive, and particularly ones which were largely factories, the bringing together of large numbers of people to do assembly. We've seen in the response to the pandemic assembly, the massive use of 3D printers to produce face masks and equipment for health services, this role will continue. There will be less need for physical proximities, more interactions like this one will be virtual, and computers will continue to crash and frustrate the way that we communicate. But digital literacy will be a fundamental basic skill, and it's one I'm going to have to learn. And the next slide, please. Will actually, in a ironic way, actually stress regions and local collaborations, because the supply chains are going to have to shorten. I have a friend, colleague, neighbour here, who has a tractor, and he can't use it because he's waiting for a small plastic component coming through from China. Therefore, assembly is going to have to be much more local. People are going to have 3D printers within their garages and putting things together locally. This is all going to be interwoven with green issues. I know we've been obsessed by the pandemic for the moment, but the main threat to humankind remains global warming and the green issues, and work with machines. Machines are going to, I mean, let's take the laptop. The laptop doesn't replace you. You can't put the laptop on a desk and let it take over your job. What the laptop does is it extends your capacity. It enables you to talk to a wider range of people, to store more information. But as regions develop their particular recovery style, you're going to see what I call networks of competence. They're not going to be long-term jobs. We're going to be doing things within a network. For example, within South Wales, a cybersecurity community has grown up, where people within a region have interactive skills supported by an infrastructure which helps them in terms of access to information technology, human resources, the right sort of finance. Because people in the future will be buying things which are deliverable by digital means: communications, creativity, design, entertainment, knowledge. And the machines will do the work, but the providers will give a sense of purpose. So if I move on to the next slide, we can see that the nature of employment will change to accommodate this. There are not going to be jobs for life anymore. We've got to live with instability. To counter that, the people who are in work will have to develop their confidence in their skills and ability to acquire new and enhanced skills. You've got to be comfortable in yourself. You've got to wake up in the morning and feel that you can go out and use your skills to earn an income. Working and learning will become much more interactive. We're seeing employment changing through the use of platforms and gigs, where people hire themselves out, as it were, to an internet platform, and work is organized through these virtual mechanisms. So contracts, job descriptions are becoming much more fluid. We're moving away from the old industrial model of formally turning to work in the same way every day. And there's a steady rise in networked employment. I mentioned the example of South Wales with the cybersecurity. You also get it in places like Manchester, where you have a large community around the application of digital techniques to culture, around mobile phones, creating short-term videos, computer games, things like that. And people aren't looking for work from others. They're generating their own work and putting their skills out into the ether. My grandson wants to be a YouTube sensation. He's not getting a job. He is being, he is going out and creating something. So just moving on to the final slide. We will have to improve our skills at networking and communications. The silos of vertical employment will give way to much more lateral systems to network, But where the human comes in, the boundaries and limitations created by humans are good. Thank you, and apologies for disrupting the flow of the seminar.
Well, thank you so much for a very succinct summary of sort of what it looks like on the ground and what we should expect, and what individuals who are developing their policies, because we're looking at it from a bird's eye view, some of the considerations that you really need to have in terms of how things may end up turning out on the ground, and whether there's alignment between what we're proposing and what can actually go through and have impact. Thank you so much. My last but not least final speaker today is also one of our co-chairs here at Task Force 6. He's a dear friend and colleague. We go way back, and it has always been a pleasure to work with him. He's an inspiration to work with. Dr. Victor Pineda is the president of World Enabled. He's also Chancellor's Research Fellow and an adjunct professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a leading global expert on disability rights, policy, planning, and design, and has worked closely with the US Department of Treasury, World Bank, United Nations, UNESCO, UNICEF, name it, he's been there. He's worked around the world within the UAE, Venezuela, Serbia, to develop policies and programs that include persons with disabilities as equal stakeholders in development. He was appointed by President Obama as a board member for the Board, which is an independent federal agency that provides leadership in accessible design. He's also the brainchild of the Global Compact on Inclusive and Accessible Cities. I don't know, many of you may have been with us over the past 8 weeks. He's led an amazing webinar once a week that tackled issues on inclusion of persons with disabilities and persons who are older in terms of all aspects of how the COVID pandemic has impacted their lives, whether it's education, health, access, technology, you name it, it has been discussed. I appreciate him being with us. It's very early in the morning in California, and I know he has a very busy day, but I would like to give the floor to Dr. Pineda to maybe just talk to our authors and our policy brief authors here today in the network. What does it mean to be inclusive, and why is it important? You know, what does diversity and inclusion really mean? Many of us, I think, in the bigger general world, think of diversity and inclusion being male, female. But yet for many of us, it takes on many different facets, and there's a lot of intersectionality. So I'd like to pass it on to you so that you could maybe get our network to start thinking about, when they're writing their policy briefs and they're looking at them, how are we truly inclusive, and how do we really provide opportunities for all? Dr. Pineda, the floor is yours.
Dr. Heidi, as always, it's a tremendous honor and a pleasure to join you and to be invited to speak with this esteemed panel. The speakers that came before us really all highlighted one major theme, which is that we're facing a great transformation. I just recently published a paper on this in a blog specifically highlighting how this great transformation is also a great opportunity to redress the types of exclusions and to stimulate new types of dialogues around an infrastructure that is being built at such an incredibly fast pace that it either has the potential to bring us together or pull us apart. But at the same time, it is simultaneously bringing us together and pulling us apart. So let me talk a little bit about values. Then I'll talk a little bit about operations, the how-to. And third, I'll talk about how to ensure that we understand that the future is accessible and inclusive. So to start off with values, I believe that any future we build in this great transformation has to be based on values, and the values of human dignity, the values of individual choice, and the values of inclusion, participation, and freedom are very important as guiding factors to ensure that the technology, the economic choices, the political decisions that are being made further ultimately these basic elements of human dignity and basic freedoms and liberties. What that means from diversity and inclusion is that whether you're talking about gender, or you're talking about age, or you're talking about disability, or you're talking about race or religion, you're really talking about a diverse set of human experiences and a diverse set of lifestyles and preferences. Many of these, however, don't exist in an abstract form. They live in a context, meaning that people with disabilities or women experience capabilities or capability deprivations based on those values that create systems of exclusion. Now, I myself am speaking with you in Berkeley, California. I normally sit in an electric wheelchair and I use a machine to help me breathe because my physical condition is such that my muscles are very weak due to a neurogenic condition, neuromuscular condition, like muscular dystrophy or ALS. However, having a wheelchair in a country or in a city that has accessible public infrastructure means that I'm not mobility impaired. It means that I have the basic freedoms and opportunities to mobility as other people. I'm not deprived of those capabilities. So I think this great transformation is about understanding the types of technologies and the types of decisions, political, economic, social, and cultural, that can either deny and deprive people with capabilities or enhance those capabilities. And then the other section of this, in terms of values, is that this disruption with the COVID-19 in the coming months, as other speakers have mentioned, will shift the creation of value, the jobs, the livelihoods, and the existing ways that we have organized the means of production. So if we value equity and equality, we will ensure that the fourth industrial revolution creates innovation for inclusion. So I call this inclusive innovation in the fourth industrial revolution. What do we need to do to ensure inclusive innovation forms part of this technology-driven transformation? And what do we do to unleash this rapid growth to ensure no one is left behind? I think there's 5 evaluative elements to this. And I'll go through these very, very quickly, and then this is the how-to portion. Number 1, ensure that these legal measures and the laws that are going to be developed to regulate technology have an explicit focus on supporting equity, inclusion, and accessibility. so that we really are proactive and explicit that we don't want regulatory frameworks that leave others behind. The second area for the how-to is to ensure that leadership and budgets are adequately determined in a way that provides enough flexibility to understand the digital divide, to understand and address and finance those elements that will ensure equity and inclusion, whether it's in education, whether it's in job training, whether it's in smart cities and IoT devices, right? The third is about institutional capacity. We've noticed that the largest technology companies like Facebook, Apple, Google, IBM, all have chief accessibility officers, not just as part of their diversity and inclusion strategy on race, gender, and so on, but actually accessibility is a form of innovation. So building the capacity in these institutions, whether it's government, private sector, national or local, and NGOs, to have accessibility as a form of innovation, I think opens up and eliminates barriers to participation. The fourth how-to is participation specifically, which is how do you create broad representation, not just one group, but actually understand the multiple identities and lifestyles and preferences that a variety of different communities, and we know that diversity stimulates innovation. And fifth, the final area is to understand awareness raising. We each should be advocates for equity and inclusion within the fourth industrial revolution. We each should be embedding principles in the Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in shaping this new normal, in shaping and defining the new social contract. Ultimately, to conclude, the future is accessible, not only because it is more innovative and more productive and leverages the human capabilities and potential of nearly 1 billion people in the world that live with disabilities, or 1 billion people in the world that are increasingly entering older demographics. But also it's accessible because it's going to be accessible by design. All the largest players are seeing accessibility and inclusion as innovation, and we should as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Heidi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pineda. I really appreciate, again, you being very succinct and very targeted in terms of the clear messages that you've delivered. I know this is an area that can be very overwhelming for many people, getting your head around diversity and inclusion and who does that include and how to get around all the nuances and make sure that we meet all the needs can be a daunting measure, especially when you're dealing in crises and you're almost forced to try and prioritize things. But I think, again, looking at the COVID-19 crisis, it's brought home very much home to a lot of people that as humans, we have to prioritize. We have to let go of some of the things that may have been something we really thought we wanted because we want to be inclusive. We need to have that broader perspective, because if we don't all win, then we all lose. And if we leave people behind, there's always that risk of, one, how do we live with ourselves in the future? But we actually lose a part of our humanity. And I think this has always been the struggle and will continue to be the struggle as we look at the digital age and all the benefits it brings, but really being aware of what are the risks and how can we work around it, and really harnessing everybody's ability to think outside the box. Some of the best solutions can come from some of the most unlikely sources. And sometimes we don't have to give that much when we're inclusive. We actually all win. So I'm very cognizant of the time. We apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we had that maybe we lost some time on. I want to thank my panelists for answering many of the questions that came up. They were answered in written form. I do want to address one question because my admin team is saying that we're close to time and we have to wrap up. So I do want to address one question that Dr. Riyad Najm addressed to us, because I think it has applications and implications for all of the writers and authors. That is, do we have to include COVID-19 in our policy briefs, as that may take away from what our original intention was? Again, I will default to Dr. Fahad al-Turki on that, but if he'll allow me just to state what I know to be true, it is not a requirement for you to include COVID-19 in your policy briefs. However, we do urge you to really consider, what does COVID-19 mean to your policy brief, particularly in this task force? This task force is about the digital age. I would challenge anybody to say they weren't impacted by COVID or they will not be impacted by COVID moving forward. So please take a few minutes. We're happy to sit and create think tanks and some focus groups to discuss it even more. Think about it. It's not going to negatively impact on your policy brief, but I do think more than likely 99.9% of our policies will have some kind of COVID implication. I would also urge everybody to say, as we are in the middle of the storm, yes, quick wins are very important, but also think long-term. We're gonna start coming out of this. And when we're talking about policies, policies are not quick win, quick fixes. Generally, they take time, and by the time we roll them out and see the implementation on the ground, we've already moved past the initial crisis. So I think for us to be very impactful and strategic, really let's start thinking about where we're going and what we think we're getting into and how our policies will impact that. So with that, if there are any other questions we haven't answered, we will respond to them with the network directly and to the individuals who asked it, and potentially through our social media platforms. I don't know, Dr. Fahad, if you would like to add anything regarding COVID-19 on the policy briefs?
Thank you, Dr. Heidi. I agree with you 100%, and that's the aim. And that's why we have these series of webinars for each of the task forces. And as we heard from the speakers and the panelists today, COVID-19 is everywhere. The impact of the crisis on the digital economy and the technology is very obvious. And reflecting this into our policy recommendations will actually strengthen the policy recommendations and make them more relevant. And I see many of the authors and the co-chairs today doing that, and I think it doesn't undermine. So thank you, Riyad Najm, for your question. I think it highlights the importance of incorporating the magnitude of the crisis into our policy recommendations and creating our work more relevant. Back to you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad. Well, with that, since we are a little over, we're 3 minutes over, I would like to first thank my panelists and everybody who participated here, Dr. Sandra, Dr. Fahad, Dr. Munir, all of my panelists, Dr. Mohammed, Angela, Paul, Peter. You know, this is truly a team effort, bringing this together. You know, it's great minds thinking together and aligning. And when you align, beautiful things happen. Again, with great opportunity comes great responsibility. I know every single member here, including our administrative backbone, Sarah, Kumil, our other Sarah, and other people who started with us and are no longer with us. We couldn't do it without each other. So thank you, everybody, for all your efforts, for working around the clock through sickness and in health. I really appreciate it. So for me, I pray that everybody stays well and healthy. And I pray that years from now, we can look back and say we were part of a beautiful, positive change for everyone. Thank you. I pass it back to Camille.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heidi. This was a great discussion. Thank you all panelists, thank you all speakers, and thank you too for those who participated with good questions. Before we leave this meeting, I would like to inform you that all information about Task Force Test can be found on the website of T20 Saudi Arabia. I'm very glad to see how many of you have turned up today. And with this, we come to the end of this webinar. It was great to have you with us, and we hope to see you in our other meetings. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Doctor. استودعناكم الله. في أمان الله. And to all my panelists, thank you. Catching up with some of you soon, but I appreciate you all, one and all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Heidi. Appreciate your leadership.